Hello and welcome. Our top story is from South Africa. Pretoria could further anger Donald Trump right at the beginning of the new year. How? By hosting Trump's adversaries for a Brics naval exercise. On screen you can see 2 Chinese warships in Cape Town waters. These are the Taihu 889 and Tangshan 122. China is the one leading these drills. Yesterday, the Chinese naval destroyers were joined by an Iranian warship, the IRINS Makran. It is the largest vessel in Iran's naval fleet. And this is a view that Donald Trump is certainly not going to like, because he is not on good terms with any of these countries. A Russian warship has also arrived in Cape Town, and the UAE is also expected to send ships for the joint drills. It is called the Will for Peace 20.
That's where Saudi Arabia comes into the picture. It is the world's second largest oil producer, which means funds are not a problem. In addition, they also bring clout in West Asia. The BRICS Bank's annual summit is underway. Here's what they told the Financial Times. In the Middle East, we attach great importance to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and are currently engaged in a qualified dialogue with them. So talks are underway. And this is part of Riyadh's broader engagement with BRICS. They want to join the bloc. Saudi Arabia's membership is expected to be taken up during the summit in August this year. If all members agree, BRICS could have a new member. Does mess up the acronym though. Anyway, what does Saudi Arabia bring to the table? Deep pockets, influence in West Asia.
There's Good Hope, which is exercised with Germany, and there's also been some with the US, but these exercises have tailored off recently in the last couple of years. So now we've got this exercise between the BRICS nations. This exercise is a little bit eye-raising because BRICS is economic. It's definitely not a military, definitely not a political grouping, and most certainly not a military alliance. And so we've seen this sort of kind of morphing of BRICS into something more than what some of the original founders, I think, intended.
The next maritime exercise is expected to take place in 2028, and it's unclear which countries will participate.
South Africa's role inside BRICS has shifted decisively from participation to leadership as the bloc accelerates efforts to reduce reliance on the United States dollar in global trade and finance. What began as exploratory discussions among emerging economies has now evolved into coordinated policy moves, institutional reforms, and bilateral trade mechanisms that directly challenge the dominance of the dollar-based system that has governed international commerce since the end of World War II. Backed by Russia, China, and India, South Africa has positioned itself as a central architect of this transition, leveraging its diplomatic reach, financial infrastructure, and strategic position between Africa, Asia, and the global South. The dollar's dominance has long given the United States unmatched leverage over global trade, sanctions enforcement, and capital flows. For decades, commodities such as oil, minerals, and agricultural goods have been priced predominantly in dollars, forcing countries to maintain dollar reserves to conduct basic trade. This structure has allowed Washington to weaponize access to the global financial system, particularly through institutions such as SWIFT, the IMF, and correspondent banking networks. BRICS countries, many of which have faced sanctions, trade restrictions, or policy pressure, increasingly view this system as both economically costly and politically risky. South Africa's entry into BRICS in 2010 was initially viewed as symbolic, representing Africa's inclusion in a club dominated by large emerging economies. Over time, Pretoria transformed that symbolic role into strategic influence. South Africa's advanced banking sector, deep capital markets, and experience operating within Western-dominated financial systems gave it unique credibility when proposing alternatives that would still meet global compliance standards. Unlike Russia and China, whose proposals were often framed as confrontational, South Africa consistently positioned de-dollarization as a pragmatic economic diversification strategy rather than an ideological rupture. Momentum accelerated following the expansion of Western sanctions on Russia after 2022. These sanctions exposed vulnerabilities not only for Moscow but for any country dependent on dollar clearing systems. South African policymakers publicly acknowledged that the precedents set by sanctions raised long-term risks for emerging economies seeking strategic autonomy. At Brics finance ministers' meetings and central bank forums, South Africa increasingly advocated for settlement systems that would allow trade in local currencies without disrupting global market access. China brought scale, Russia brought urgency, India brought institutional caution, and South Africa brought diplomatic balance. This alignment proved critical. While China's yuan offered an alternative settlement currency, concerns remained about convertibility and transparency. India, wary of rapid shifts that could destabilize its economy, pushed for gradualism. South Africa proposed a multi-layered approach: bilateral local currency trade agreements, expansion of the new development banks lending in non-dollar currencies, and the development of a Brics payment messaging framework that could operate alongside SWIFT without triggering systemic shocks. The new development bank, headquartered in Shanghai with strong South African involvement, became a testing ground for these reforms. Loans denominated in rand, yuan, and other BRICS currencies expanded steadily. South Africa emphasized infrastructure and energy projects that could be financed without dollar exposure, reducing foreign exchange risk for borrowing countries. This approach resonated strongly with African and Global South partners who had long struggled with dollar-denominated debt volatility. Trade data reinforced the shift. South Africa increased the share of trade settled in local currencies with China and Russia, particularly in energy, minerals, and agricultural products. India and South Africa expanded rupee-rand trade mechanisms, bypassing dollar intermediaries. While the dollar remained dominant, the direction of travel was unmistakable. Each transaction conducted outside the dollar reduced exposure, built technical expertise, and normalized alternatives. Western financial institutions initially dismissed Brics de-dollarization efforts as symbolic. That tone changed as settlement volumes grew and more countries expressed interest in joining Brics or adopting its mechanisms. South Africa's 2023 Brics Summit in Johannesburg marked a turning point. Under Pretoria's leadership, the bloc announced expanded membership discussions and deeper financial coordination. The summit carefully avoided incendiary language, instead emphasizing stability, inclusivity, and reform of global governance structures. This framing mattered. By avoiding overt anti-US rhetoric, South Africa positioned Brics not as a rival bloc seeking to overthrow the system, but as a coalition correcting imbalances. That narrative proved attractive to middle-income countries seeking flexibility rather than confrontation. Behind closed doors, however, the implications were clear: a world where the dollar is one option among several, not an unavoidable gatekeeper. The United States and its allies took notice. Treasury officials publicly reiterated confidence in the dollar's dominance, but private assessments acknowledged long-term erosion risks. European policymakers expressed concern that fragmentation of payment systems could weaken sanction regimes and complicate trade enforcement. Yet they also recognized that dissatisfaction with the existing system was widespread, particularly among countries bearing the costs of volatility without enjoying decision-making power. South Africa's credibility stemmed partly from its ability to speak both languages. As a country with deep ties to Western markets and institutions, it could not be dismissed as an outsider. At the same time, its leadership role within Africa and the Global South allowed it to articulate grievances shared by dozens of economies. This dual identity made Pretoria an effective bridge rather than a lightning rod. Africa's stake in de-dollarization is substantial. Many African economies face chronic currency shortages, debt servicing challenges, and exposure to dollar fluctuations. South Africa used its Brics platform to argue that alternative settlement systems could unlock intra-African trade, strengthen regional value chains, and reduce dependence on external financing. The African Continental Free Trade Area amplified these arguments, aligning continental integration goals with Brics financial reforms. China's support added scale and infrastructure. Beijing expanded cross-border payment systems and currency swap lines with South Africa and other Brics partners. Russia accelerated energy and commodity trade outside the dollar, using South Africa as a key diplomatic ally in Global South forums. India's cautious endorsement provided legitimacy, signaling that de-dollarization was not reckless but strategic. Critics argued that alternatives lacked liquidity, transparency, and trust. South Africa responded by emphasizing incrementalism. The goal was not to replace the dollar overnight but to build redundancy. Multiple currencies, multiple settlement channels, and diversified reserves would reduce systemic risk. This argument resonated after repeated global shocks exposed the fragility of concentrated systems. Domestic politics also shaped South Africa's approach. Economic growth, employment, and investment remained priorities. Officials stressed that de-dollarization would not mean isolation from Western markets. Instead, it would enhance resilience. South Africa continued to attract Western investment while expanding non-dollar trade, demonstrating that diversification and openness were not mutually exclusive. Over time, rhetoric shifted from de-dollarization to currency diversification. This semantic adjustment reflected South Africa's strategic discipline. The message was reform, not rebellion, yet the structural impact remained significant. Each new agreement normalized alternatives, reducing psychological and technical barriers. By the mid-2020s, the results were measurable. A growing share of Brics trade settled in local currencies. Central banks diversified reserves. The new development bank expanded non-dollar lending. Payment infrastructure matured. South Africa's influence within these processes was widely acknowledged, both within Brics and beyond. The implications extend beyond finance. Reduced dollar dependence weakens the effectiveness of unilateral sanctions. It reshapes geopolitical leverage. It alters negotiations over trade, security, and development. South Africa understood these stakes and navigated them carefully, avoiding zero-sum framing while advancing strategic autonomy. Global reactions remain mixed. Some Western analysts warn of fragmentation and inefficiency. Others acknowledge that reform was inevitable given shifts in economic power. What is no longer disputed is that the process is underway and that South Africa is not a passenger but a driver. As Brics continues to expand and attract interest from additional countries, South Africa's model of disciplined, pragmatic leadership offers a template. It shows how emerging economies can challenge structural imbalances without triggering instability. It demonstrates that financial power is not only about scale but about coordination, credibility, and narrative control. The dollar is not disappearing, but its monopoly is weakening. In that transition, South Africa's role stands out as both strategic and consequential. By aligning with Russia, China, and India while maintaining global credibility, Pretoria has helped reshape the architecture of international trade in ways that will reverberate for decades.
You've been watching Echoes of Africa, where every story carries the sound of tomorrow. If this moved you, subscribe now, like, and share so Africa's voice never fades into silence.